Welcome to part 12 of our exploration of the Old Testament. Here we come to the return of the exiles to Jerusalem and Judea. A change of empire. A change of empire is a little bit like a shift in the Earth's tectonic plates. We all know that the Earth's crust is not continuous, it's a series of overlapping plates, and when any one of those plates shifts, there is either an earthquake on land or an earthquake under the sea. And the earthquake under the sea causes enormous tsunamis. We know that from the recent ones, 2010 in Sumatra and 2011 in Japan. Great upheaval to peoples, and the change of empires are the tectonic plates of history. When empires change, there are enormous upheavals for peoples. In this instance, there is a change of empire from Babylonia to Persia. And in that change of empire, the peoples who have been deported from Jerusalem and Judea to Babylon are allowed to return. This is the final story covered by the Old Testament, and that's what we're going to look at now. Here I've put two maps side by side. The first one you can see is the Babylonian Empire, short-lived, with its weakness that it didn't manage to conquer Media and Persia. Along came Cyrus the Great, and he subdued the Babylonian Empire and expanded his empire through a greater part of the world at that point. He didn't really manage to conquer Egypt at that stage, but his son Cambyses, he managed to consolidate the empire. As we said, the Babylonians failed to gain hold in Media and Persia, and this was to prove their downfall. So Babylon was invaded in 539 BC, and he became the emperor of the Persian Empire. Now Cyrus, called the Great, was an enlightened ruler. Shortly after his victory over Babylon, he made an edict freeing peoples deported by the Babylonians, allowed to go home to their own lands and to take with them their temple treasures. And these edicts were inscribed on clay tablets and sent out to various colonies of the empire. We have one in the British Museum. It's usually on display and worth having a look if you get a chance to go there. The timeline is not easy to discern. It's fine when we come to Cyrus's edict, which was probably around about the year 538 BC, and that's covered in Isaiah chapter 2, as we'll look at further down. As we get further down into time, we find it a little bit more confusing, because we really have to go on Ezra and Nehemiah, and the text of those two books of the Old Testament are not that difficult to decipher in places. But it looks like we have a time of coming back from exile that stretched a fair old way. If you think that they started out shortly after 538 BC, then Ezra's second mission was around about 400 BC. So that's over 100 years. So the exile's return was not completely all at once. It took a long time, as we shall see. With the downfall of Babylon and the rising of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, hopes began to rise. And it's in this period that we can look at second Isaiah. If you remember looking back at the last section, it is thought that there could be three prophets who are conflated together as Isaiah. And second Isaiah says this: "Comfort my people, comfort them, encourage the people of Jerusalem, tell them they have suffered long enough, and their sins are now forgiven. I have punished them in full for all their sins." Jerusalem, of course, is the people of Judah. That's chapter 40. By chapter 45, Cyrus is actually named. Now, we're not sure whether this is hindsight or whether it's an amazing prophetic proclamation, but he is proclaimed as being their saviour. And so the hope was that they could return to their homeland. And the question is that we'll look at, will they actually fulfill their destiny? The account from the Old Testament of the return of the exiles is not easy to disentangle. Books covering the period are Haggai and Zechariah, two prophetic voices, and Ezra and Nehemiah, more historical voices. Now, you've got to think about the fact that over 70 years have passed. It's highly probable that the original deportees have actually either died or were incredibly old and were not up to making a journey back to Jerusalem, because let's not forget that the journey would be at best on donkey back, but usually on foot through very rugged and often dangerous territory. But the miracle is that some were fired with zeal during the exile to want to continue to worship and serve Yahweh, and that they were willing to make an effort. There seems to have been three waves of return over that at least 100-year period, and we'll try to unpick what happened. The first return was under Sheshbazzar. Now, he was a prince of Judah, and that's around 538 BC. He says they set off in good heart, the neighbours helping them, giving them things to begin to rebuild the temple. As I say here, information is scant, but it seems that the numbers were relatively small, and they had the daunting task of rebuilding a temple that had taken 40 years to build in the first place. It looks like even in the ruins of the temple some form of worship began. But when they were taken into exile, the vacuum that was left in Jerusalem and Judah was filled by a variety of people. It was governed but from Samaria, and as we shall see through the journey, Samaria became a problem. And as the story goes on, we have great opposition from those who believed it was their territory, and so they tried to stop things by meddling, by complaining to the emperor, but none of it actually was any avail. Eventually, the temple really was built. It's important to say that Sheshbazzar soon fades from the account, his place taken by his nephew Zerubbabel, and he seems to be regarded as governor. But none of them are seen as the prince in the line of David. And indeed, very soon, Zerubbabel disappears from the text and the royal line is mentioned no more. Life was very difficult. It seemed like there were a series of years when the harvest was poor. They had the external problems. They were trying to not only build a temple but build their own dwelling places. It must have been incredibly hard. And it seems that they got demoralized and work on the temple ceased. The second wave really was some 18 years later. There was a resurgence of energy and the temple was completed. By this point, the Persian Empire was in turmoil. As in all empires, small revolts in many places had to be quelled. Eventually, under Darius I, they were quelled and a period of peace ensued. And this peace seems to have been very helpful to the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the surrounding area. Haggai and his prophecies, a little quote here, saying you're having all these bad things happen to you, bad harvests, attacks, because you haven't rebuilt God's temple. And so they're set to, and by 515 the temple is rebuilt. Of course, it was probably a shadow of the temple that Solomon built, but nevertheless it was a temple and worship could continue. Alongside the rebuilding of the temple was reformation. Little Israel was despondent, confused and leadless. The dream of a return to the past had not happened. Things were beginning to drift apart. But into this situation came two important figures, Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra seems to have been perhaps of the priestly line. Nehemiah was cupbearer to the emperor, so he had the ear of the emperor. And as we read from the book of Nehemiah, he was able to go back, taking a lot of resources with him, go back to Jerusalem as the governor of Judea. Ezra is a bit more difficult to discern. He seems to have made 3 visits or stayed over 3 periods, but we're not sure at all. Some say 2, some say 3. But under Nehemiah, the people are rallied, and it seems that different clans were given different portions of the city walls to rebuild, and they did rebuild. And by chapter 7 of Nehemiah, the work is complete and the city defences are organised. But as I said, Ezra and Nehemiah set about a complete reform of Israel's religious and civic life. They wanted a return to a pure Yahweh worship, a return to living a holy life. And into that, they're told to obey the Sabbath, and they're told to get rid of non-Jewish wives. We can imagine what an upheaval that was. I'm sure it was only partially achieved, that there was a core of deeply religious people who were doing everything to fulfill the law, to live by the law, and to live pure and holy lives. And it seems to me that as time went on, these were the ones that developed into the Pharisees, the holy ones, and of course that can often set in, that legalism sets in, and instead of a joyous free worship of Yahweh, we come to legalism and the law. But at this point, it's a rally to holiness and returning to the pure worship of Yahweh. At this point, we seem to leave the biblical text, and information after that is incredibly scant, but we will cover that period which we call the intertestamental period, in the next and final part 13. So we've reached the end of the Old Testament period, which ends, as I say, with Ezra and Nehemiah. Israel is settled, but the grand vision of the universal reign of Yahweh is unfulfilled. It's a time of relative stability, but obscurity. The vision to be a light to the world is unfulfilled. Exclusivity and particularity set in. That is what by Jesus' time became Pharisaism. It's a far cry from the vision of the great prophets. This period of relative stability, I use the word relative because we don't really know how stable it was for Judea, but what we know is that that all came again to another hiatus with the conquests of Alexander the Great, right between 356 and 323. The tectonic plates of empire were to shift again, and cataclysm would descend on Israel. But that's something for the next period. Thank you for following with me through this.